Want to try a new way to finish off bias tape when you're using it as a facing for a sleeve or an armhole? Actually, it's not new at all. I learned it from this vintage sewing pattern. I love when you're working on a sewing pattern and find a little hidden gem of a way to construct something that's a little bit different than what you're used to. Whether it's a common method that you just haven't encountered before or something a little bit unusual. One of my favorite ways to finish a short cut-on sleeve or sleeveless armhole that's faced with bias tape, like on this top, does not use the typical construction order. It's a method I learned from this vintage sewing pattern several years ago. If you always apply bias tape to an armhole or a sleeve after the side seam is closed, give this tutorial a try because you might just like this different way of doing it. I'll walk you through how to do it on this top that I'm working on. But hey, if you'd also like tips on how to smoothly apply bias tape around the curve of an armhole, I'll link my tutorial on that in the description. Can I fit? Yes! This is more commonly how you would be told to apply bias tape in a sewing pattern. You'd sew your side seams first, and then apply the bias tape around the armhole or sleeve after joining it in a tube. But that's not how we're going to do it. There's two different types of garments where you'd most likely want to try this alternative method. If you're sewing a cut-on sleeve, like the 1950s top I'm sewing here, or if you're sewing a sleeveless top like this one. In either case, if you plan to finish your armhole or the end of your sleeve with bias tape, that's where we'll construct things a bit differently. And here you can see how this technique was illustrated in this late 50s or early 60s sewing pattern where I first saw this method. Now this is just one drawing to show the method, but don't worry, we'll go through it step by step. First, if you're sewing a cut-on sleeve like me, you'll want to sew according to your pattern's instructions, basically up to the point where you sew the bodice shoulder seams. So you'll sew any darts or pleats and sew your shoulder seams as directed, finishing the seam allowances however you plan to, like serging or pinking them. I've also finished my neckline here, this cute little rolled standing collar that I'm doing. But what you don't want to do here is sew your cut-on sleeve / side seam, which for a cut-on sleeve is obviously all one seam together. So stop here and don't do anything else yet. And what if you're sewing a sleeveless top and you want to try this alternative construction method? If you're sewing a sleeveless top like this one, you're going to basically stop at the same point as I said for the cut-on sleeve. So according to your pattern's instructions, up to and including sewing the bodice shoulder seams, which are pretty short on this shaped armhole. Similar to the cut-on sleeve bodice, you would stop here and you would not continue to sew your side seams yet, because that step is where our sewing construction will take a different path than you're used to. And maybe sewing a garment isn't the only place where you'd like to dabble in trying something you're not used to. If so, then it's a great time to check out Skillshare, today's video sponsor. As the largest online community for creatives like us, Skillshare has something for everyone. They offer thousands of classes led by industry experts in countless categories from beginning to advanced. They're designed by creatives for creatives. Maybe you've always wanted to try animation, or brush up on your painting skills, or learn to knit. Skillshare has you covered. I love creating scenes with felt for things like ornaments, but I've been doing a bit of paper crafting lately. So I thought I'd try the class Papercraft Art, a cutting-edge guide to paper illustrations. And the little scenes she makes are so inspiring. Whether you're trying something totally new or already experienced, Skillshare's wide range of classes cater to every level, allowing you to dive in exactly where you fit. And with their on-demand platform and classes that build on each other, it makes it easy to progress at your own pace whenever you'd like. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. So here's my cut-on sleeve without the side seam sewed. So I'm just going to open this all out so that it's flat. Or if this were an armhole, you'd have the armhole open too. And I've got my single fold bias tape ready. With this open, I'm just going to pin the bias tape to the raw edge of the sleeve, like normal, matching up the raw edge of the bias tape with the raw edge of the sleeve or the armhole. If you're doing this on an armhole that has a curve to it, definitely check out my other video that I mentioned about smooth bias tape around a curve, since all those tips apply if you're changing the construction order like we are here too. But mine is flat, so this is pretty easy. I don't bother to trim the ends off just yet, but you can if you want to. I like that with this method, you don't have to be as precise with the ends of the bias tape. Once you have your bias tape pinned, you'll just sew this on the sewing machine like normal in the little narrow fold that's closest to the raw edge. Once the bias tape is sewed on, press it away from the bodice lightly. Now this one is optional, but I like to do a little preparation for a later step, and I fold in the bias tape towards the body and give that a press too. But that's just a prep step, so this is key here. You're going to open it back out because we're not going to actually sew it like that. So our bias tape is sewed to our sleeve or armhole. Trim off any bias tape that's hanging off the fabric if you didn't do it earlier. What we're going to do now is sew our sleeve/side seam, or in the case of a sleeveless armhole, just our side seam. Place your right sides together, and you're going to open out that last little bit of your bias tape at the end so it's completely open, and pin all the way down from it down your side seam. Use extra pins in the bias tape if you need to, because it can be a little fiddly. And then you're just going to sew the side seam at your usual seam allowance for your pattern. And we now have our closed up sleeve or armhole after we applied the bias tape. And you can see that the ends of the bias tape meet up nicely inside the sleeve. After pressing, you'll trim down the seam allowances and finish them however you normally would, like for a cut-on sleeve, reinforcing the curve and clipping the curve. If you're using a serger to finish the raw edges, I recommend that to cut down on some of the bulk in the bias tape area, after serging you can trim down the serger stitching out of the seam allowances of the actual bias tape. Or instead, take a little snip below the bias tape and serge it below that. Then trim down the seam allowances in the bias tape separately and press them open like I've done here. You may just have to press that last fold of the bias tape back into place a little. And with the right sides of the bodice out again, we have our bias tape applied to our sleeve and our closed up side seam. All you have to do next is fold your bias tape to the inside of the garment. That's why I like to press it earlier to make this a little bit easier. Pin that into place, and then you're free to finish off however you'd like, either attaching that free side of the bias tape by hand or finishing it off on the sewing machine by top stitching. With this method, you don't have to get the length of the bias tape right perfect in a tube first, or apply it to the sleeve or armhole when it's closed up either. So you might find it a little easier sometimes. Is this way better or worse? Nope, it's just different. You know what I always say, I love to have options. Give this method a try, you might like it. Check out one of these other two videos, and I'll see you again soon with more vintage sewing. Now I'm making myself laugh for no reason. Okay.